Welcome to Sense of Place. Happy New Year. So good to see you guys. My name's Sarah Fox. I'm the host and curator of Sense of Place. I'm very excited for tonight for a few reasons. One, about 6 or 7 years ago now, I did a podcast called, an episode for the podcast Here in the Gorge. And the episode was on tribal fishing. And as part of that episode, I got to meet Terry Brigham here. So if you guys listen to the episode, Terry's the feisty fisherwoman you heard in it. And the other voice you would have heard is Dylan, who's here tonight. And basically, since doing that podcast, I've been trying to woo Dylan to come to Hood River to talk to us about the legal side of tribal fishing history. And apparently a job, a wife, and a child in Idaho was enough to trump what I needed. But this year, after many years, I roped in some of his friends who helped twist his arm. So I'm very excited to have him here tonight. The topic, more than a fish, is something I wouldn't have thought of until I spent time outside of the Northwest. And I spoke with family of ours who, as families do, try to catch up on what you're up to. And my husband works in hydrology, and he does a lot of work trying to restore salmon habitat. And so we would go visit the family, and they would ask about, how are the salmon doing? We were like, I mean, they're doing okay. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. And they would always kind of look at us weird, and we finally realized that it was very strange to them that we talk about salmon so much here. And I actually, when I was working on the podcast, the editor was from, or was living in Arkansas. And she also was kind of like, now why are the salmon so important to this story? And I realized the blind spot I have, having grown up here, that this fish is such an iconic species for us for a lot of reasons, some that we're going to hear about tonight. And so part of the reason Sense of Place has approached this in so many different ways with the podcast. And then also some of you guys may remember Buck Jones, who was here last season and is here now as well. One of the very memorable stories that Buck shared, Buck grew up out in Umatilla and Pendleton area and fished some, not as much maybe. And then you moved here and you were living with a family on the river fishing. And in the process of living with that family, you were what? You were sleeping up on the fishing nets. You knew a spot you could go sleep on the fishing nets, right? And while he was up there, he discovered this laundry hamper, and in it were all these huge binders. And he started looking through them and realized they were full of Supreme Court decisions about tribal fishing. And it was a light bulb moment for him, because here he was, probably in your 20s, and this is the first you were hearing of it. And so this is some of the history that we're going to dig through tonight, and I think it's history, but I also hope that you walk out tonight realizing that this is a contemporary story as well, and that there are a lot of reasons that this fish is more than just a fish, and it touches us in so many ways, whether we're a member of one of the 4 treaty tribes here or not. And Dylan's going to help give us some of the milestones legally that help us make sense of that history piece. So before we do that, I want to thank our sponsors who every season show up. They don't make me twist their arms the way Dylan did. You guys are great supporters, and you make it easy and fun for me to reach out to you each fall. And I also want to thank Mount Adams Institute. Sense of Place is a program of Mount Adams Institute, which is a local nonprofit here in the Gorge. And with that, I want to have you guys help me welcome Dylan Hedden-Nicely to Sense of Place Season 16. Come on up. I hope it's okay I gave you some trouble when you weren't here to defend yourself.
Yeah, well, better late than never. Really thrilled to be here. Thank you all for having me. It's an amazing community.
So one of the things that we talked about having you just sort of share first is your background and the work you're doing and why that's even needed.
Sure. So I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. My family's from Oklahoma, but I was born and raised in Idaho, in Boise, the other whitewater capital of the universe. So I grew up in the intertribal community in Boise, and I was really interested in physical sciences, hydrology, and water resources when I was younger. And so when it came time to go to law school, I kind of had this general idea that I wanted to work on water issues and natural resources issues, but that was really the extent of it. I didn't really have a firm understanding that there was this thing called federal Indian law. I had a general understanding that tribes had treaties, and that was an important thing. But I was lucky that I found a mentor when I was in law school, a woman named Angelique Eaglewoman, who took me under her wing and really helped me to understand the importance of being an advocate in Indian country and for Indian people. And so when I had the opportunity to join the faculty at the University of Idaho at the College of Law and run the Native American Law program that I went through. And one of the interesting things that I don't think a lot of people know is that Indian tribes couldn't even pick their own lawyer until the 1980s. They had to, all of their legal contracts had to be approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so it's a fairly recent phenomenon that tribes even had legal representation that they were able to choose for themselves. And of course, tribes, like anybody else, they want lawyers and advocates that understand the things that are important to them and where they come from. And so it is increasingly important for tribes to have representation that representatives that are tribal members themselves. And it's becoming increasingly important as tribes become increasingly sophisticated in their business dealings, in their dealings around their own sovereignty, those sorts of things. What am I doing? How do I get this?
Alex, do you want him to hold it closer? Yes, he says yes.
Okay.
There you go.
Is that better?
More like rapper style, maybe?
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
I'm always afraid of microphones.
Don't be afraid. So one of the caveats I was going to give tonight, because I think there's a lot of new people here who maybe are new to the Pacific Northwest, and this idea of having sovereign nations within a sovereign nation may be a totally new idea, and no shame in that, because there's a lot of history to learn, and we're not all going to know it. So I want to come back to that nation within a nation idea, but since we're talking about fish tonight, maybe we start with the time which pre-European Americans out here, what was the scene for the tribes in regards to salmon and populations and abundance?
Yeah, so I was doing a little bit of research on this because it's something that I didn't know firm numbers on, and so I was speaking to some of my friends that work in this industry and in this area, and the short answer is that people don't really know what the abundance looked like specifically, but what we do know is that there was the fish runs in this region were astronomical compared to what they are today, and we have a graph here that kind of shows, in general terms, you can kind of get a feel for the general order of magnitude, anyways, of what the fish runs looked like. And so fish runs today run around 2 to 2.5 million fish running in the lower Columbia. What they estimate is that around 1855, the fish runs are at around 16 million plus, right? And so you're talking about 800% as many fish as we see today. And it was, the Columbia River Basin was one of the most prolific fisheries in the world. And I was trying to like every once in a while you see these videos of like aerial views of some of the fish runs that are still in Alaska where you can't even see the water. There's so many fish, and I was trying to find something like that, and there really isn't anything that shows that for the Columbia River, of course, because we haven't had these fish runs for a very long time here. But one way that you can kind of get a feel for the magnitude is by looking at some of the historic photos from the canneries, and so we have another photo that shows that. And I think that folks that are from here are probably familiar with these sorts of things, but you're just talking about, millions and millions of fish. And as a result of that, this was a majorly important place for indigenous people that relied on these fish since time immemorial.
And that's for culture and for economics. I mean, it's playing into so many different pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what you have here is a situation where, the people that are indigenous to this region have been interacting with these fish species for thousands of years, right? And so for 10, 20,000 years, and their life cycle is completely revolving around these fish. And so as a result, the relationship that you develop with those, it's not just about sustenance, it's not just about subsistence, it's about, your entire lifeway is really geared around interacting with these and relying on these fish.
I remember at one point, one of the phrases I heard when I was researching for the podcast was they called basically the Celilo area the Wall Street of the West. Like before we even had that concept, this was the place where people were coming to do commerce. So.
Yeah, so we actually have a map of that. So
That's that one, right?
Yeah, so what a lot of people, Wall Street of the West is a really great way of putting it. I mean, I don't know if people realize just how core this place is, one of the most important places in North America for thousands of years, right here, right? And the reason for that is what this shows this shows the trade network that Native people were engaged in all across the country. And so we're over here, right? And not only is this, Celilo is the key place in the Northwest, but you also have people that are trading all the way over from, the Dakotas, the upper Midwest. There's a lot of material over there that indigenous people is not available to indigenous people in the Northwest. And so that's working its way across the country and then up to Celilo. And this is the place where all of that stuff is getting traded. And so this is really it's a hub for indigenous people for a lot of different things, and that's all revolved around the fish. The fish is what made this the place that it was.
So the fish eventually also attract other people who are not tribal. So we're going to kind of move through history pretty linearly here, I think, because that's going to help us understand how these milestones affect each other. So when we had that map earlier of 1855, there's a lot of crucial things going on in the 1850s between the treaties and then also the westward migration. So maybe talk about how we move from this abundance to now that some competition is coming.
Right, so, and I think folks here are probably pretty familiar with this history. So the first thing that you have is starting in 1855, the United States enters into a series of treaties with the four indigenous people, or the four tribes, the largest tribes in this area. So it's the Nez Perce, the Umatillas, the Warm Springs, and the Yakimas. And all of those treaties, and we'll see some language from those treaties here in just a minute, but all of those treaties look fairly similar, and the essence of that deal was in exchange for the tribe's territory, vast tracts of territory, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The United States made promises to the tribes as well, and what that did was that opened up this area for non-Indian settlement. And the reason why people were initially wanting to move here again, was because of the fish. They were wanting to move here in order to farm, and then also to become fishers and take advantage of the cannery industry, so the salmon fishery. And so two things occurred. The first is they, non-Indians, bought up all of the land right along the river, and they started systematically excluding indigenous people from that land. And then the other thing that they started doing was they started building these fish wheels. And I'm sure that folks have seen pictures of these fish wheels. We have a picture of it, or one of them. There's dozens, hundreds of these. And you can see here, so there's two people standing, just to give you an idea of the scale of this thing. And so they're massive, essentially, funnels. And so salmon and steelhead, they run in schools, they run in pods, and so they'll all come up at the same time, thousands, millions of fish, and they'll run together. And what this essentially would do is they would run into these gates here, and they wouldn't be able to go upstream anymore, and they would just sort of work their way around to the fish wheel, and the fish wheel would just scoop them up, and they would essentially scoop up the entire run that way. And so there's dozens of these running all up and down the river, and so in that way, by one, just physically not allowing tribal members access to the river, but then two, through technology, non-Indians were able to essentially monopolize the resource and prevent tribal members from accessing the fishing that they had a treaty right to continue to do.
So there's this huge shift. We go from the tribes are the ones doing the majority of the fishing to pretty quickly it's non-tribal members, and tribal members don't even have access. So not only are numbers down, but there's not even a chance to go get fish. And I think this is where I want to make sure we talk about these treaties and we're clear on what they really mean. Because I think it's, like, we hear the word treaty, but we don't always recognize that it truly is the same as the treaties we would have with another country, except this is a country within a country, and we're trying to share space. So it's complex, and those treaties, one of the things that you shared for the podcast was they were all unique depending on the group of tribes, but there was one thing that was the same in every single one. And so maybe talk about the UNAs and what that meant for that wording to be included in them.
Yeah, so I think, so we'll start a little bit before that, just so that we kind of have a full understanding of the history surrounding this. And so if you pull up the map of the four territories here, and so when we're talking about, they refer to the treaties, these treaties as Stevens treaties, and the reason that they're referred to as Stevens treaties is because they were all negotiated on the United States side by a single person, a guy named Isaac Stevens, who was the territorial governor in for the territory of Washington. But he negotiated these four treaties. He also negotiated a series of similar treaties in the Puget Sound. He got over into the Blackfeet and into western Montana as well. But for our purposes, we'll just talk about these four. And so he negotiated with these Lower Columbia tribes, the Nez Perce, the Umatillas, the Warm Springs, and the Yakimas. That territory there, so before the United States entered into this treaty, those four tribes held sovereign ownership and control of approximately 39 million acres of land. That's the same size as the entire state of Washington. And when I say they owned it, they didn't just own it, they were in control of it. They were the sovereigns. And that's not me saying that. The United States Supreme Court, Justice John Marshall of Marbury versus Madison fame in 1832 wrote that America was inhabited by a distinct people, divided into separate nations, independent of each other and the rest of the world, having institutions of their own and governing themselves by their own laws. In 1908, the Supreme Court found that the Indians had command of the lands and the waters, command of all of their beneficial uses. whether kept for hunting and grazing, roving herds of stock, or turned to agriculture. And so they had complete ownership of everything, including all of the natural resources in this area. And the reason why that's important is because when you start from that frame, then the question isn't, well, what did the tribes get? The question is what did the tribes give up? Right? That becomes the important thing. And so just to make this a little bit more concrete, let's look at the next map, which is, I'll just use an example of the Yakimas. So the Yakimas historically held approximately 13.4 million acres of land. It's that area that's in sort of that light purple there. That's approximately the same size as the state of West Virginia that they ceded away. They ceded away all but 1.4 million acres. That's how much land is the current reservation. And so what did they get for that? Well, they were paid $200,000. Which ends up, when you do the math, that ends up being a little bit less than 1.5 cents per acre. And I don't raise that to make it, to point out how unconscionable that is. I raise that because obviously money was not the basis of the bargain for the tribes. That's not what they were doing when they agreed to this cession of land. They weren't trying to get money. Well, what were they trying to do? What they were trying to do was reserve a homeland. And they were trying to reserve a way of life. And so one of the things that is included in all of these treaties is this language here in Article 3. It includes the exclusive right of taking all of the fish within the reservations, as well as the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places in common with the citizens of the territory. And so what the tribes negotiated for and what the United States agreed to was, from now forward, forever, you can continue to fish in all of your usual and accustomed places in common with the citizens of the territory. And so it's a perpetual right that the United States promised. And in exchange for that, all of us that are not tribal members, what we got was we got the right to live here and make our livings here, right? And raise our families here. And so the reason why I get to live in Moscow, Idaho, which is Nez Perce country, why all of you get to live in Hood River is because the United States, on our behalf in 1855, made this promise. And so really it's incumbent on all of us to continue to enforce this promise because we are the beneficiaries of it as much as the tribes are. And so the other thing that's important to remember about this is as the Supreme Court pointed out, again, if you start from the point of the tribe had ownership of all of these things, then the question is not what did the tribes get in these treaties? The question is what did the tribes cede? And anything that the tribes did not cede, they've retained. And so these fishing rights are explicitly retained. But other things also, it's called the Reserved Rights Doctrine. It's a legal doctrine that the Supreme Court has recognized over and over again. Silence in a treaty means that the tribe retained but did not cede away any of those rights. And this comes up over and over again in a series of, not just one, but a series of Supreme Court cases over the years.
So maybe we go back to that and go back to the fish wheels. I want to show this here. So land now, folks have come out and either been given land by the federal government or they've bought land, and of course they want the most desirable land. If you notice, these darker areas, those are where the reservations are now. You notice that none of them are actually on the Columbia River. So that usual and accustomed space is very important. Now there's no access, and that brings us to one of the first, I think, really important legal cases, which is, what is it, Winans v. U.S.? Or is that right? Okay, so maybe tell us about I don't know if it's Winans or Winans, but the Winans brothers. What happened with them?
Yeah, so I call them the Winans brothers, but I think it's probably actually more properly to say the Winans brothers. The Winans brothers were homesteaders, and so they came in after 1855, and so again, so if you look at our area here, Yakima, Umatilla, Warm Springs, sort of where the river is running through, all of that land has been ceded by those three tribes around the river. And what does the United States do with all of that land? They immediately start to repossess it to Euro-Americans, to non-Indians, through Homestead Acts, 1862 Homestead Act, through Desert Lands Act, later Mining Act, etc. And so immediately, what non-Indians start doing is they start patenting, receiving patents for the lands all around the river. And the Winans brothers were one of those groups of people that were doing that. They switched over from farming to fishing pretty quickly. They were installing fish wheels, but where they started getting crosswise with the tribes were their property was located at an historic fishing station for, I believe it was Yakima tribal members. And they would not let the Yakima tribal members go across their property to access the river so that they could continue to fish. And in this case, the United States actually, interestingly enough, this is a 1904 case, so this is during a time when the United States was not really doing a lot for tribes. But the United States in this case did bring a lawsuit that ended up going up to the United States Supreme Court. And a Justice McKenna, a justice that decided that case, as well as sort of the seminal water rights case that I spend a lot of time working on and thinking about. He also authored that opinion. But that he was the one that really came up with, or most clearly enunciated the reserve rights doctrine, this idea that anything not expressly ceded away is retained. And the reason why that becomes important is because of the language. If you go back to the language of the treaty, what the Winans brothers were arguing was, well, this in common language, this in common with the citizens of the territory, really all that is saying is that they should have the same rights, that Indians should have the same rights as anyone else. So you go and get a license from the state, you follow all the state regulations. And so it's just saying that we're not going to actively exclude you from being able to fish. But you didn't acquire any sort of unique rights as a result of this treaty language. And Justice McKenna called that an impotent outcome. That certainly would be an impotent outcome from a nation that promised more and a tribe that expected more. And so what Justice McKenna said is this language, even though this is ambiguous, what does this in common with language mean? We're going to apply what are referred to as in the law as a canon of construction, and the Indian canons of construction say that ambiguities in treaties are to be resolved in favor of the tribes, and they're to be resolved, treaties are to be interpreted as the tribes would have understood them. And clearly the tribe understood that what it was doing with this treaty provision was retaining the right to be able to fish at its usual and accustomed places, free from interference from non-Indians. And so that is the decision that the court lays out in 1904, which unfortunately does not resolve the matter.
Well, and I remember when we spoke for the podcast at one point, when you were first talking about, okay, the land has been ceded, the rights have been reserved. It could have been the perfect solution. Clearly, it has not been the perfect solution. So after this Winans case, what happens? Why doesn't that resolve things and we can carry on as was originally planned?
I guess the big reason why is because non-Indians continued to refuse to, recognize the scope of these treaty rights. And this is in an era that's referred to as the allotment era. There's a general understanding that tribes and tribal members are going to be assimilated into broader Euro-American culture, and so the idea is well, these treaties were not meant to be permanent, right? They're just meant to be sort of a placeholder until these tribes sort of disappear. And so as a result of that sort of thinking, and frankly just people wanting to have wanting to hold on to the resource for themselves, as well as states wanting to push for more control over things that it viewed as being part of its own sovereign prerogatives. States continued to interfere with tribal fishing for much of the early 20th century, and unlike in the Winans case, the United States is not really doing a lot to support the tribes during that early era. And in fact, the tribes go back to the U.S. Supreme Court in a couple of cases in the early 20th century, even before we get into sort of the fish war era, which we're going to talk about next. But states start trying to tax tribal fishing. That goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court knocks that down. States start trying to require tribal members to get state licenses. That goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court knocks that down. And so it goes on and on and on. And every time, it's like whack-a-mole, right? Every time that the state tries something, tribes have a successful outcome in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and then that gets rendered illegal, and then the states kind of go back to the drawing board and they say, oh, okay, well, the court said this, but it didn't say this, so let's try this over here, right? And on and on and on it goes. And then you get into the 1950s and 60s, which is another era in federal policy referred to as the termination era, where the United States was actively severing its relationship with tribes. And as a result of some of those things, states are really starting to try to assert control over tribal fishing at that point.
And it's also, I mean, as this is all happening, part of the pressure was coming on because the fish population, like we saw in that first image, it's really, so treaties, 1855 treaties, we're now into the 1940s, 1960s, and there's a problem if we want this fish to stick around. And so what do we do? And I think one of the things that always makes a moment memorable is when you realize you haven't known something big. And when I was researching and working on the podcast with Terry and Dylan and started digging, and if any of you guys get the Sense of Place newsletter, you may have seen the video. And this phrase came up, the fish wars, and I started digging more and I started digging more, and I realized that while the civil rights battles that we're all so familiar with were going on nationwide, here in the Northwest was a very unique civil rights battle, and instead of sit-ins, there were fish-ins. And in the video that I shared in the newsletter, there were two fisherwomen who got pulled from their boat by the state, and we'll get more into the details of that, but I guess for me what was really shocking was that this crucial piece of history I'd never even heard of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's not something that is, I think, commonly understood, outside of, select circles, particularly in the Northwest. But I wanted to circle back to this point about scarcity and just make the point that this precipitous decline here was not because of tribal fishers, right? Just to state the obvious, right? So we have really high numbers. We have this massive, you saw the picture of the canneries, right? So that's one cannery. We have dozens, if not hundreds of canneries all over the Northwest. And then what happens in the early 20th century is we start sticking giant concrete structures in the river, right? And so by the time we get into the 1950s and 1960s, we're at a low point in fish populations. And the state's answer to this is well, obviously the problem is the Indians, right? They are not, because we're not able to control their fishing, we're not able to regulate how they're fishing. They are making it so that non-Indian fishers are not receiving their fair share of the fish that are available, and so they start really cracking down both in Washington and in Oregon and in Idaho, right? Each of the Puget Sound and the tribes up in the Puget Sound, the Muckleshoots and the Puyallups and the Lummies, they're really kind of famous, and that's where a lot of the pictures are from. Billy Frank Jr., and for good reason, right? That's where a lot of the fish wars took place. But the tribes down here had their own fish wars. The tribes in Idaho, the Nez Perce tribe, also had fish-ins in Idaho as well. So this was taking place all over the Northwest, and each of those states, through their fish and game departments, were really actively and violently cracking down on tribal fishing during this time. And this was at the same time as the Civil Rights era, right? So there was a lot of inspiration within tribal communities to also expand and work on their rights from their own perspective, right? They had different goals, and they had different reasons for engaging in civil disobedience than African Americans did in the South. But at the same time, they're taking a lot of inspiration from those movements as well.
Do you want to explain what some of that civil disobedience looked like?
In the case of?
Like some of the fish-ins and it was sort of, like some of what led up to what we're seeing here. So maybe bring us up to that era of things, up to speed.
Yeah, so I know more about the legal history than was actually going on, but so there was a lot of, to the extent that tribal members were able to access rivers, they were continuing to engage in fishing in their traditional ways, and so they were either netting, or they were gaffing or spearing, or they were using dip nets. And what would happen is law enforcement, state law enforcement officers or fish and game officers would come, ticket them, confiscate their equipment. And so then what tribal members started doing is, in order to try to insulate themselves, right, you have power in numbers, and so tribes would set up fish camps, tribal members would set up fish camps, and try to prevent that sort of stuff from happening, which then resulted in more and more draconian tactics being employed by state fish and game officers, which eventually led to violence. And eventually it got the attention of the United States. My understanding is it got the attention of the United States when one of the Justice Department lawyers was at a fish-in, and he got attacked by a state law enforcement officer. And so once the non-Indian Justice Department attorney got cracked on the head by a baton, suddenly lawsuits started happening from the United States Department of Justice. One way or the other, what ends up happening is in Oregon, the tribes initiated a lawsuit called So Happy versus Smith. So Happy is a Yakima name. And later on, the United States initiated its own lawsuit that became United States versus Oregon. Those cases got consolidated into a single case, and that becomes the case that recognizes the tribal right to fish on the Oregon side. And then at the exact same time, the United States brought a lawsuit in the Puget Sound that became the United States versus Washington, which is the famous Bolt decision. And they essentially came to the same conclusion, that what the treaty recognized was the in common with language on the Judge Bellani here in Oregon. What he found was it entitled the tribe to a fair share of the catchable harvest. What Judge Bolt decided was it was half, up to 50% of the catchable harvest. Neither of those decisions went up to the United States Supreme Court, so they were final decisions. Unfortunately, what the state of Washington in particular, I'm not as familiar with the Oregon history, but at least the state of Washington, they just ignored the decision. They continued to prevent tribes from engaging in fishing. They started passing state laws that were inconsistent with Judge Bolt's decision, and essentially made it illegal for state fish and game agencies to enforce the decision. And so eventually those issues went up all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Passenger Vessel. And the US Supreme Court in the 1980s finally recognized that yes, these treaties entitled the tribes that had these Stevens treaties to a sufficient amount of fish to provide for a moderate standard of living up to 50% of the catchable harvest. And so today, the Stevens Treaty tribes are entitled to up to 50% of the catchable harvest. But then of course the issue is 50% of zero is zero, right? And so now what the big issues that the tribes are dealing with are less around the issues around whether the tribe has the right to fish has been settled by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so now what the big issues are is trying to make sure that fish continue to be there for the tribes to be able to catch and harvest.
Do you recall the percentage that the tribes were taking prior to the Bolt decision?
I mean, so you have something like 12 Stevens Treaty tribes in the Puget Sound. Of course, we have the 4 tribes here, and so each of those tribes is going to be different. Mm-hmm. But it was nowhere near the catchable harvest. And then of course, a lot of the Puget Sound tribes, they now are fishing in the marine areas as well, mm-hmm. Where they probably were a little bit before that, but not nearly as much. And so it would have been significantly less. And certainly, I mean, when the states were actively regulating them, they were catching hardly anything, mm-hmm. Because whatever they were catching was getting confiscated, unless they could do it without getting caught. And when you're fishing is hard enough.
No, it's really easy, right, Terry?
It's hard enough, and it's really hard when someone's, attacking you with a baton.
Yeah. Well, and I remember you shared your dad and your uncle one time set a net and then went up to go check another net. And when they came back, that first net had been pulled up and torn or cut.
It was actually
Cut off from land, just floating down. Because those nets are made, they're not, you don't go buy a net. Yeah. And then you said another time they came back and was it their boat or their truck? The gas tank had been filled with sugar.
That was another tribal member's. My dad's boat was shot.
Your dad's boat was shot. Mm-hmm.
He left the boat and went home. When we got back, there was holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
So they patched the holes, and never left a boat without somebody watching it since then.
Mm-hmm. That's cut. Yeah, yeah. So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's an important point. It wasn't just law. I don't know. Law enforcement might have done that, but it wasn't just law enforcement that was doing these things, right? It was a concerted effort amongst not just law enforcement, but a lot of people. I was at an event in Riggins, Idaho, which there's one of the hatcheries that the Nez Perce tribe manages is right outside of there, at a place called Rapid River, and I was there with a council member from the Nez Perce tribe, and he was making the comment that we didn't go to Riggins when I was younger because it wasn't a safe place for us to be. He talked about trucks with bumper stickers that said "Save a fish, spear an Indian," and so this was It was a systematic approach to trying to exclude tribal members from fishing.
It was interesting. I remember looking at old film reels is that once the Bolt decision came down, there was a lot of commercial fishermen, non-tribal, who said, I don't care what you say, I'm going to go fish. It was a very interesting flip of the coin there, that because there was not going to be enough fish for all of them to stay in business. And so a lot of them were put out of business, and a lot of them said they'd keep fishing regardless of the rules.
Yeah, so I mean, so since then, since the decisions came out in U.S. v. Oregon and United States versus Washington, like a lot of it's been around management, and a lot of it's also been around intertribal disputes around determining which tribe has usual and custom fishing locations and where, and also because now the questions around management versus the question of whether a tribal member has a right to fish. Tribal members don't feel the pressure to exercise that right as a form of civil disobedience, and so what has happened is that's provided the tribes themselves the space to develop management regimes. So they now regulate their own members, right? And so what happens today, and Buck knows more about this than me, but what happens today is there's a determination as to what the catchable harvest is for a given run. There's a determination about how much, and then from there you start divvying that up between the tribe and non-Indians, and then amongst the tribes. And then once that's figured out, the tribes then police themselves, and so they'll have wardens that are at the stations. They'll be actually counting fish and making a determination as to when their catchable harvest has been exhausted for that particular run, and then they'll shut down the run. And if you, as a tribal member, are fishing past that point, again, tribes are sovereigns. Tribes have courts. And so tribal members can be cited by tribal fish and game officers. They then have to go and appear in a tribal court, and they are answerable to the tribe for breaking the tribe's fish and game rules.
Is that part of what the Columbia River Intertribal Fishery Commission is part of? Is that part of the regulating? It is CRITFIC?
Yeah, so again, Buck would know more. My understanding is that CRITFIC, the Columbia River Intertribal Fishing Commission, they're more of a science-based organization, and they're also around developing the resource, doing restoration, doing those sorts of things. They may develop guidance around around best practices for regulations, but I think that they leave it up to the tribes themselves to actually develop their fishing regulations, but I could be wrong about that.
So yeah, you're right, we are a science-based organization, but what really came into impact and upholding our sovereignty is right over here, is that we got our enforcement line.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tribes set their own seasons, their own regulations, and we have tribal tribes come down and monitor, and they have their own policing, but intertribe police actually upholds the tribal laws.
Mm-hmm.
So they're regulated to enforce the tribal laws, because Terry and I's tribes, they set their own seasons and they set their own regulations, but the Yakimas, they can set their own seasons, and then they enforce their own from their own tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Tribal boundaries.
So that, or this pointing we're doing, when you guys get on the first exit from Hood River going on 84, you'll see it right there. So now you'll know. CRITFIC, if you hadn't seen it, that's the Columbia River Intertribal Fishery Commission enforcement arm is right there. And you also, just since we're here, we should talk about Zone 6, because I learned about Zone 6 from Terry. You want to tell folks why this section of river is so special?
Nope, I want Terry to
Okay,
do it.
Terry's going to tell.
Before that, I was trying to say, for enforcement for us, it should be understood that it's a federal.
Here.
No.
It's what they asked.
So what should be noted is, as far as enforcement, it's a federal jurisdiction, because we are a nation within a nation. So it's not state that, or maybe we're getting ticketed by the state, but our tribe can come along, and that is federal at that point. So, and then Zone 6. Zone 6. Even closer to the mic. Oh, good Lord. Zone 6 is the only tribal commercial fishing area for all the four tribes, the four river tribes, Bonneville to McNary. There's definitely sports fisheries that are in there, but it's only sports. We are the only tribal commercial fishermen that go in there. We can get licensed below Bonneville to Astoria, and we have to go through the steps of the state. But the treaty was reserved our usual and custom areas, which they narrowed it down to Bonneville Dam to McNary to have two definite lines instead of an ambiguous, well, we used to this or that, and so the state or the feds, whichever it was, said Zone 6 is for tribal, the Four River tribes.
This is Zone 6 right here. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, Dylan.
No, that's great.
Yeah, and Zone 6 is, as Terry mentioned, is from Bonneville Dam all the way to McNary. So it's 147 miles on both sides of the river. And these zones start at the estuaries, the Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, Zone 4, Zone 5, all the way up to Bonneville. So that's how they set those zones. So the Zone 5's below is usually, well, they're not as much commercial as it used to be down there, but that's the tribes only have the commercial in this Zone 6.
Special zone out here. Okay, so we've gone real fast, I know, but the fish wars, we have the Bolt decision, which you guys maybe have heard about. That was a really big deal. And I think it's easy for this story to feel very just historical and very sort of static. The tribes are here. There was a lot of fish. Non-tribal people came. Things got really messed up. There's some bad times. Fish are still struggling. Story's done. That's not actually the case. And I think this is I hope that people walk out, one, with a sense of I don't know if hope's the right word, but this is a contemporary story that's still being written. And the arc, the trajectory we've gone through in just a century from the states versus the tribe in some really aggressive ways to where we are now in co-management and restoration. I think that's a really important piece of this story. So maybe talk about where things go from the Bolt decision.
Yeah, so the Bolt decision, as I mentioned, didn't resolve much for a while, because although the decision was final, the state of Washington just refused to recognize it, and so it wasn't until the United States Supreme Court issued a decision in the middle of the 1980s that it finally got resolved, since then, tribes and especially the states of Oregon and Washington have sort of been they've been locked in an uneasy marriage, I suppose would be the way you could maybe put it, where they at least initially there was some recognition that, okay, so the tribes now have these rights, we need to figure out what that means, right? And so that is when organizations like CRIPFIT are created, Northwest Intertribal Fishing Commission in the Puget Sound area, UCUT in the Upper Columbia, so these science-based organizations that are being invested in quite heavily by the tribes themselves, and to a lesser extent the United States, around management issues, to the point where tribes pretty rapidly became the most sophisticated managers in particular basins, especially in the basins where they're based out of. They have the knowledge, the local knowledge about the specific watersheds that they're really using, and I think from that, states started to take notice. And so today, I think, although the relationship is far from perfect, there is a lot of respect on both sides for fisheries management. And the point that I really I always try to make when I'm in settings like this is that tribes really are putting their money where their mouth is. One of the things that I think it's less obvious. What a lot of people see is they see the tribes fishing. They see the tribal members fishing and taking fish, and a lot of times they're taking more fish than non-Indians are allowed to take under state law. But what people don't realize is how much the tribes are investing. So just to give you an idea, these are rough numbers, and if anything, they're probably on the low end. But for example, based on my research, Nez Perce tribe in my neck of the woods, they have around 200 employees that are dedicated to this work. They're spending somewhere between $20 and $30 million per year. They have 3 hatcheries, including they manage the Dorshak National Fish Hatchery. The Umatillas, they're spending around $27 million per year. They have between 75 and 100 employees working in this area, as well as a hatchery. Yakima is spending in that neighborhood maybe even more, as well as Warm Springs. The Yakimas in the Warm Springs each have 3 hatcheries that they either own or they're managing. By way of comparison, let me talk about give you a few more numbers really quickly. Yakima Nation, since 2008, they've improved 1,900, and this again probably on the low end, 1,900 miles of stream riparian habitat, and they've reconnected for fish passage up to 557 miles. Umatilla, 500 miles plus made an additional 190 miles of habitat accessible, and so they are spending. This is an incredible amount proportionally to their budgets. They're investing in these fish and also the streams. And these aren't all streams that are sitting on the reservation. A lot of these streams are streams that we're all using. Just by way of comparison, the Washington State Salmon Recovery Funding Board, which is a mouthful, it formed in 1999. And the state of Washington has invested in that board since 1999, $424 million. So that's about $16.5 million per year. Since then, they've opened around 1,900 miles of stream habitat. They've restored around 2,400 miles of stream habitat, right? And so when you start to think about what the state of Washington's budget is compared to these tribes, these 4 tribes have between 2,000 on the low end, Nez Perce tribe, Umatilla, 8,000 plus, maybe 12,000 for the Yakimas, right? They don't have the ability to tax. Even though they're sovereigns, the United States Supreme Court has essentially prohibited tribes from being able to tax non-Indians, and taxing their own members is not a great economic development strategy, and so they don't do a lot of taxing. A lot of these tribes are not located in areas where gaming is a huge revenue stream, and so we're talking about a huge proportion of their annual operating budget, and those are large opportunity costs that they're taking on as a result. You know, these tribes have significant socioeconomic issues on their reservations, and they're making the choice to invest in these fish and in these streams, and we're all the beneficiaries of that. Most of those hatchery fish are not being caught by tribal members. Most of those hatchery fish are being caught by non-Indian fishers. And so the reason I bring all of that up, again, is not to, say that the states ought to be doing more, but just to point out just how much the tribes are doing in this arena and how valuable their work is in this space. And as a result, we're seeing real results. Of course, the gross numbers are still problematic, and there are big issues there. But as a result of this work, there's more habitat for the fish that are making it, and as a result, there is what we're doing is I think buying a lot of time and hope, and the other thing the tribes are doing is creating a lot of political pressure to try to encourage some of these larger, more systematic changes that need to happen in order for the fish to actually have a sustainable future.
If you guys were here, Miles Johnson, the legal director for Riverkeeper, I think 2 seasons ago, came and spoke, and it was right after there was something that happened called the Six Sovereigns, where, as I understand, you'll correct me here, it was the 4 Columbia River Treaty tribes, Nez Perce, Umatilla, Warm Springs, Yakima, and so those are 4 sovereigns, and the other 2 sovereigns were the state of Oregon and the state of Washington, which for me was amazing as an outsider to think of the arc from the 1960s in some of the videos and photos that we saw like this to now an agreement of these 6 sovereigns on a national level. So I think I just hope that that's a reminder of that this story continues to evolve, and at the heart of it are these fish that have such a unique connection with our tribes here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, right? It's not just, the work that tribes are doing, of course, is the most important piece of that is the work that they're doing to protect the fish and to protect the water and to rehabilitate the streams. But a really great secondary benefit is the improvement in the relationship that tribes have with the states as a result, and the credibility that tribes now have because of the work that they're doing with especially at least in my experience at the staff level within state agencies, a lot of respect, a lot of mutual respect, and that makes it a lot easier for tribal fish and game managers and tribal natural resource managers to pick up the phone and actually make effective positive change on behalf of everyone, but in particular their members. So that relationship is developing. It's never perfect, and of course politics still get in the way quite a bit. But the fact that there is a relationship now is a major improvement from the way it used to be.
If you're game, I want to make sure if there's any other things you want to share before we get to Q&A that you share them. Otherwise, we'll launch into Q&A.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. Alex, will you bring up the lights a little bit? So I'm going to give you guys a chance. If you have questions, don't hold back. Can you tell me my name?
Bob Weisfield?
No, Bob. I was going to give you my funny voice.
Hi, thanks for being here. Actually, I was a judge in West District Court in Klickitat County starting in '78. In all those cases you mentioned, we would have the Yakima tribe lawyers coming into court. They were the best cases I heard, to go through the usual and accustomed fishing rights and get all that history. So I appreciate that from you. But a couple of questions. Can you talk about the in-lieu sites and how that worked in? And maybe the status of the dams on the Snake River. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with the in-lieu sites, so I don't want to guess. I think that these two might have a better answer for you.
Good question. So there is it was mentioned in the 30s, when Bonneville Dam came in and it inundated and flooded a lot of our traditional fishing villages and sites. So the Army Corps built 5 original in-lieu sites. In lieu of us flooding your areas, we have these fishing in-lieu sites. Those original in-lieu sites are at Cascade Locks, Lone Pine, Cook's Landing, Wind River, and Underwood. So those were the original in-lieu sites that they built. And then the Kriftik and some other of the tribes, the Army Corps found some additional properties along the river that are called treaty fishing access sites. So there's 28 additional treaty fishing access sites. The closest one's right up here at Stanley Rock, and you go across the bridge, there's one at White Salmon there. Those are treaty fishing access sites. So there actually was made, to have water access, boat access, to get to the water. Some of them have restrooms, communal net racks, fish cleaning stations at some of them. And they was made for seasonal use, but a society kind of has impacted that there's year-round residency at those places now. So that's the end of sites. Entry fishing active.
And so for the lower snake dams, this is something I know a little bit about. I'm not steeped in it, but for those, I do live near the Snake River. The Snake River is the Columbia River's largest tributary. It contributes something like a third of the Columbia River's water supply, and it's also it's a massive drainage area, and on the lower Snake there are 4 dams that are all run by the Corps of Engineers, and those dams are primarily managed for barging access to the port of Lewiston, which is in Idaho. Idaho actually has the furthest inland port in the continental United States, and so you can barge wheat. In my neck of the woods, in the Palouse, they're growing a lot of wheat, and then they will, at least historically, they would barge it from Lewiston here to Portland, and then ship a lot of it overseas. My understanding is that there isn't a lot of barging that is currently taking place. There's a secondary benefit of those dams is a little bit of hydropower, but not a lot. And so my understanding is from an economics perspective, those dams are not really, they've exceeded their useful lifespan, but there's a lot of people that are continue to be really invested in the continued existence of those dams. But in particular, the Nez Perce tribe has really been leading the charge for decades at trying to get those 4 dams removed, and that's been a roller coaster ride for them. Mike Simpson, Representative Simpson, came out in favor of at least starting to look at developing a plan for a phased removal. The 6 Sovereigns Agreement that Sarah alluded to was built around, developing the infrastructure that would be necessary to replace a lot of the benefits that those dams are currently, or at least are supposed to be providing, with the idea being that once at least we're far enough along on our way to replacing some of those benefits, then you can start thinking about removing those dams. But currently where that is at is the Trump administration has, I believe, put a stop on moving forward with the 6 Sovereigns Agreement. Buck would probably know a little bit more about that. And as far as I know, at this exact moment, there isn't a lot of talk around removing those dams. But one thing I will say is when you think about time in terms of like a tribal perspective, right? And you've been here for thousands of years. Tribes are really patient, so they'll be here when the dams come out.
And Bob, Inlu sites and the history and the larger story and where they're at legally right now is on my list. So just know that I'm continuing to try to figure out ways to tell that part of the story. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, Dylan, you alluded to this a little bit before. Could you say a few more words about the second Bolt decision and the ongoing culvert case in Washington that link habitat protection for fish with reserve treaty rights?
Yeah, so U.S. v. Oregon and United States versus Washington are 2 of the longest running cases in the history of the United States. And so even though, and the reason for that is because the judges retained continuing jurisdiction to enforce them. And so starting in the in the 2010s, in that sort of era, the tribes started recognizing, and this was probably an issue before then, but there's thousands and thousands of linear miles of streams that have been cut off as a result of culverts. And so, you know, everybody knows what a culvert is, right? So a culvert is just essentially a corrugated tube that instead of building a bridge, they'll stick a culvert into a stream and then they'll just build a road over the culvert. And the water will flow through the culvert. And it's a great way to deal with, if you size it properly, it's a great way to deal with flood control issues. But what culverts are is essentially you take a big stream and then you funnel it down to a really small surface area, and essentially what you're creating is a water rocket, right? So when fish are migrating upstream is in the springtime during spring floods, and so what those culverts essentially do is they create barriers, just as the same as a dam, right? If the fish can't get up through the culvert, they can't get up to the habitat, they can't spawn. And within the state of Washington, there were thousands and thousands of miles that had been cut off to spawning habitat. I'm sure this is the same in Oregon as well, but this lawsuit was in Washington. And so what the tribes did is that they banded together and they opened a sub-proceeding within United States versus Washington to try to force Washington to remove those habitat barrier culverts, because the state of Washington was refusing to do it. You know, from their perspective, what it's going to require is ripping up, you know, thousands of roads, and that's it's going to be an extremely expensive proposition. But they took the position that the treaties did not require them to do it. That was the position that they took in the district court in the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit disagreed, and so they issued a decision that essentially said the scope of that treaty right, again going back to those same treaty interpretation principles, the reserve rights doctrine, interpreting this treaty as the tribe would have understood it, the Ninth Circuit interpreted the treaty to require that not only is the treaty enforceable against the United States, the treaty is also enforceable against the states, and that it includes a prohibition on states from actively engaging in things that destroy habitat if it's going to cause degradation to the species. That went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Justice Kennedy was still on the court at the time. He had been on the Ninth Circuit when U.S. v. Washington, a sub-proceeding in U.S. v. Washington had been decided previously, and so he recused himself. And the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed the Ninth Circuit's decision 4-4 as a result. And so that's now the law. And so that they refer to it as the Culverts case. And it's a really strong precedent that says that treaty right includes, in addition to a right to fish, but also a right to demand that the habitat that's necessary for the fish to survive also continue to exist.
I think about this a lot because I'm really dorky, but when I, that title, More Than a Fish, is partly because our Northwest natural land, so regardless what you think about the tribes or whether you even think about them or whether or not you fish, a lot of the land where we live here in the Northwest is affected because of what we can do because of the salmon and because of the salmon's relationship with the tribes. There's a lot of work that we're able to do to restore this place because of that relationship and the money, as you spoke about earlier. So it's more than a fish. Okay, more questions. Man, can you guys pass this back for me? All the way to the top.
Thank you. This is really interesting. Maybe this is a silly question, but I'm curious what it would look like today if citizens, states, and the federal government had respected the treaty rights from the beginning, and what can we do to get to that world from where we are now?
Wow. Well, so I can tell you what that world would look like for me. You know, I'm not a tribal member, and I'm not from a Northwest tribe. And so I think that it's important to have that caveat, and I think that maybe asking some of some of the other folks in the audience what they think about that as well. But I think that if putting together the way that the treaty has been interpreted of late between the culverts case and some of the precedent from the earlier parts of the 20th century, I think one thing that would have happened pretty early on is there would have been more restrictions on the canneries early on. There would have been a lot more discussion about what the tribes thought about the dams, for example, compared to there being absolutely no discussion with the tribes, very little thought, probably about how this was going to affect the tribes, and so it seems highly unlikely. I mean, if we're talking about like, this scenario where these treaties are being respected and to the maximum degree possible, I don't know if there's a way that you can reconcile placing all of those dams in the Columbia and the Snake Rivers, and also fully be respecting the tribe's treaty rights. I think that there would be a lot more access, and there would be a lot more resources for the tribes to actually be able to acquire that access. Unfortunately, I think, and so what do we do in order to get there? I think that the tribes are actually doing what is necessary in order to get there, right? Again, to the judge's point, tribes take the long view of these issues, and so from their perspective, they're not thinking about this in terms of like, how can we make sure that we have, all of those things. Right now, what they're thinking about is what are the steps that we need to take in order to make sure that, one, our relatives, the fish, continue to be there. That's the most important thing. And then from there, building out and expanding their sovereignty and their ability to control their own destiny. And as they do that, they continue to push out. They continue to increase their credibility, the respect that they have from both the United States and from the states, and they're continuing to work towards, I think, that future where they do actually get to more fully engage in their treaty rights. That's the best I can do.
If you guys want to add anything, you can. I know Terry's jonesing to get the microphone. Do you want it? Okay. You pretend like you don't want it.
I know.
You're so glad you met me, right?
Oh, God. She harassed me for like 3 months.
Me too. Huh?
There's a different middle ground now. If we could go back and say, yeah, no dams or whatever, that would be a different story. But there's a different middle ground. And tribal people have always thought about the next 7 generations, not the next one to sustain for our children's children's children. And so there's no getting back, but there is moving forward to a workable solution, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think that something that, salmon is really culturally relevant to our people. It is taking that title right there. It's more than a fish, I was glad to see the trade routes on there. Salilo, was we still, it's a traditional first food for our people. It's the salmon gave up its life for us, and in doing that, we had to become good stewards of the land, good stewards of the water. Of course, dams have really impacted salmon, because salmon's used to a free-flowing rivers, and you folks know here that doesn't even look like that river flows sometimes out there. They're big pools. But something that I've worked at Cryptic for 22 years, and at one time we used to go to the sportsman shows, like at the Expo Center, and we faced a lot of resistance. We was like, well, what are you guys doing here? You know, what's the tribes doing here? And then we seen a kind of change in the attitudes of like, Dylan brought this up. Like, well, if the tribes didn't have these hatcheries, we wouldn't have no salmon. We wouldn't be able to go fishing. And then, you know, the pinnipeds at Bonneville, they say, well, we'll give you the bullets so you can kill those sea lions, you know, because they're impacting our fisheries too. So I do see a working relationship. Of course, as Terry said, it's not going to go back, but we can keep, you know, looking out for our, you know, our children's children, and hopefully that they'll be able to, you know, to do what we're doing and fish. You know, the dam's coming down. I probably won't see in my lifetime, but it's been proven. You know, the Klamath River took down dams, and those fish come back. The dam across the river, when it went down, those fish returned. So, yeah.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to give you one last question for you to think on while I do my last little bit. So I want you to look, what do you hope, I guess, by the end of your time here on Earth, not here in Hood River, what's it look like looking ahead? What do you hope to see, or what do you expect to see in regards to salmon and the relationships around looking forward? Okay, while Dylan thinks on that, Alex, if you don't mind pulling up next week. So we have a special event this month, January 29th, 2 performances, the Volcano Listening Project. If you remember the violin-playing volcanologist from a few seasons ago, I reached out to him because I needed his help for the Watershed Rock Opera, which happened last year, and he helped me out, and in the process he said, by the way, I have a group of really talented musicians, and we play music along with sonified data of volcanoes erupting. Do you think Sense of Place people would like that? Like, of course. And so this is a special project that he has put together. They have put together an album. And so next week, January 29th, will be a combination of some really incredible musicians, including a Grammy and Tony Award winner, and nerdy science about volcanoes, which I think is a pretty good combo. So there's 2 shows. It's a special event, so if you are a sponsor, please know you have to buy tickets to this one. It's not included. So it is here, right here, on a Thursday. Next month, we're going to have Lisa Perry join us. That's Lisa and her husband, Ricardo. They have a farm called Going Out on a Limb. And I don't know if you guys pay attention to the family farms here in the Gorge, and particularly in the Hood River Valley. It's pretty unique how many we have. And they're also, I'm honestly a little bit worried about them. And I want to understand more about what it takes to do what they do. And I want to understand more about what's going on that's making it so hard, because I don't know. I personally value having family farms, having 4 generations that know about this place and care for it. So Lisa's going to come talk. If you happen to follow her on Instagram, she told me when I first met her that she doesn't have any stories, and it's bullshit because she's got a lot. So she's great. I also wanted to encourage you. Buck was here. He was so kind to come back again tonight. If you missed Buck last season, the Sense of Place archive has his talk. We talk about salmon. We also talk about basketball, which Buck was a very good national team tribal league. I know I'm getting that wrong, and if you remember, if you were here at the end of the talk, Buck shot over my head, totally scored. And then also, so you can go watch him, because again, Salmon story is complex. There's a lot of different pieces to it. And then you can also, there's Terry and her sister Kim. Good looking. Like Terry mentioned, I harassed her also, similar to how I harassed Dylan, to do this podcast many years ago, and it is online. You can hear from Dylan and you can hear from Terry. We go out fishing together. You get to hear from Terry's son. You get to hear all archival audio from the time. So that is available for when you drive your car, go for a walk, or fold your laundry. And if for some reason this whole podcast thing is new to you and you're like, I don't know how you find these, I don't know how you do it, come see me afterwards. I will help you figure it out because it's really fun. And you get to hear more from Terry and Dylan. And then I think, is that the last one? Okay, thank you. Okay, so now it's back to you.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know if you can go back to the last picture or not.
The one of Terry or the one in
no,
here? Can you go to my slideshow, Alex? Okay, there we go. Is that
So
the one you want?
what this is a picture of is a picture of a ceremony that tribes of all over the Northwest have been doing of late, which is salmon reintroduction ceremonies. And so we've heard of first salmon ceremonies, but one of the things that a lot of tribes that historically have been cut off entirely, primarily by dams from their salmon fishing historically have started doing is they've started growing salmon in hatcheries and then reintroducing them into their waters, and then helping them along. And what they found is a lot of times that they do come back. And it's one of many things that the tribes, especially in my neck of the woods, have been doing to reconnect with their own historical ways of being. And so another one, a tribe that I've worked with for nearly 20 years now, Coeur d'Alene tribe in North Idaho, they started building canoes again. They were a water people, a lake people, but as a result of U.S. policy, they had been excluded from the waterways for 100 years, and so they lost all of that knowledge. They no longer knew how to build canoes, and they relearned. They built several different types of canoes, and now they host and they go on canoe journeys, and it's a thing that they do as families. And so the tribe sponsors families, and the entire family has to commit to building this canoe together as a family. And what it has done is it has reconnected the tribe to those waterways in a new and special way. And so my hope is that tribes will continue to be able to do these things. That tribes, by the time I pass away, will be in a better position to do these things. That they'll continue to push out on the boundaries of their own sovereignty, continue to grow their economies, continue to spend that money in good ways, in ways that are beneficial for their members, as well as everybody else. Continue to be good neighbors. And continue to be able to do the things that they've always been trying to do, but have been prevented from doing at times in the past. And I think that if they can do that they're going to be in a great place. I think the fish will be in a great place. Everything else, all the other plants and animals, will be in a better place. And I think that we all will be. And so that's what I hope.
All right. Thank you so much, Dylan. Dylan Hedden-Nicely. I would love for you two to come up, please, as well. Don't roll your eyes at me, Terry. If you guys don't mind, get up here. You guys all traveled a long ways. Thank you so much. Dylan Hedden-Nicely, Terry Brigham, Buck Jones. Thanks to all of you guys for coming and for listening and for sharing the story with others. Kyle, I forgot to thank you. Okay, all right, and now we're done. I hope to see you next week and next month. Thank you so much, you guys.